Good morning, everyone. Woniya here from season 6 of Alone, and I am finally getting to doing my post before the day that the next episode is out. So this week was such a bummer because it was the first time I was actually going to watch the show in real time, and I had a group of friends together, and I checked in with a bar in the town I was visiting, and they had cable and they had a TV, and we were all set to watch the show. And then it was 10 o'clock and the show wasn't on. It was a login show called Axemen, and so disappointing. And we waited, and then it was like 11 o'clock, and it was just too late to stay up and watch the show. We were all exhausted, and so went home without actually seeing it. But luckily the next day I managed to see it. So far I am 0 for 6 in terms of actually watching the episodes as they come out. I don't tend to spend a lot of time around televisions, 0 time around televisions actually, or the internet, and I try to restrict computer time, so that's just the way it goes. But this week was exciting on a lot of different levels. I was definitely really disappointed in how very many things are being left out of my story. There are so many things that you don't see. So far, someone's been keeping tabs, and so far it sounds like I've had the least airtime of anyone. So maybe because I wasn't having a lot of calamities and so there wasn't anything really exciting, but I feel like there were all kinds of super exciting things that were happening that you didn't get to see. But the beauty of this episode is pretty much from here on out, it is freaking snowy and cold. So there are all kinds of things that happened before there was a lot of snow on the ground that I was waiting to talk about because I couldn't be sure whether or not those might be squeezed into an episode. But now that there's snow on the ground, that gives me a real distinct timeline that I know that any of those things that I filmed before there was snow on the ground aren't going to be showed. So I get to talk about them, which is exciting. And you don't get to see them, which is a big bummer. But that brings me to one of the things that you can see in the brief footage of me from episode 6 is a shot of my knife on my belt. I brought a Mora knife in a day glow orange plastic handle. And I brought a Mora knife for a bunch of reasons. I love a carbon steel knife, and Mora is a good all-around utility blade, and I don't feel comfortable in the world without a knife on my hip. So very important tool for me. And I brought the bright fluorescent cover to make sure that no matter what happened, I couldn't lose the knife very easily. They were a little reluctant about that because they said that the day glow orange is just like super garish and unattractive on film. And I was like, well, I guess that's too bad because this is the sheath I've got. However, you will notice in the footage I'm talking about, you don't see day glow orange on my belt, you see furry on my belt. So, how was that? So I want to talk about that. And one of the things that got left out of the footage of the day I made that grouse kill was actually my first very important kill. So, as I've talked a little bit about, the grouse kill happened on the autumnal equinox. So I had gone a long time without getting any game from the land, but I had been trying. I'd already talked about how much I was trying to fish every day and all of the elaborate things that I made for my fishing setup, and it's occurring to me that that would be a great thing to take more footage of so I can show you how I was going about making my lures and my floats and my weights and what have you. But the morning of the equinox, I said, this is the tipping point of the year, and this is the day my luck is going to change. You saw that change with the grouse, but what didn't get shown is that up until that point, I had been taking some shots at squirrels high up in trees, and it's really hard to shoot straight up at a moving target that's very tiny, and should you miss, which happens, it is so hard to find your arrows afterwards, right? Because shooting up, it's a lot harder to judge the direction that they're going to fall in than when you're shooting sideways, plus hitting branches on the way down. So by like day 5 or so, I was down to 7 of my 9 arrows. And then in another couple days, I was down to 5 of my arrows. So I made a pact with myself that I couldn't shoot at squirrels in trees. One thing too is some of those squirrels weren't that far away from me, but it's hard to shoot a really close, really small target when you're used to actually practicing at a bigger range. So that revealed one flaw in my archery practice, is that I was mostly shooting at shots that were at least like 20, 30 feet. And doing practice at small targets closer to me would have been helpful. But that is all to say that as of the autumnal equinox, I went out that morning believing my luck was going to change, with a pact to myself that I could not take shots at squirrels unless they were low enough that the arrow was going to land somewhere within the landscape that I could see, or unless they were backed by the trunk. So I went out, I did my morning fishing as I was kind of expecting at that point, given having zero deep water and zero sign of any fish whatsoever in my area, nor any thoughts that there was anywhere that I had access to such fish. I didn't get anything, and I was heading back with my bow, which I brought everywhere, and there in a spruce tree was a squirrel at maybe chest height, backed by a landscape of rocks behind it. And so with the GoPro on, so I believe there should be footage of this, but you can never be sure with a GoPro, I took a shot at that squirrel, and I shot it right off of the branch and pinned it down to the ground behind the tree with an arrow through its chest. That was my first game, and it was so exciting, and I was so thrilled. I was walking back to my shelter to process and eat that squirrel when I saw that grouse, which was the very first grouse I had seen. So I shot the grouse, and I've talked about that, and you saw the footage of it, and you could see that I was super, super moved when I found the grouse. Part of the reason why that was so moving is that I went from zero game for over 2 weeks to 2 animals shot in less than an hour. That was part of why I felt like the land had finally truly deemed me worthy and wanted me to be there and was working with me. To go from nothing to 2 things back to back like that was very profound. But that brings me to said squirrel. So another thing that I really, really hoped that they would show, which they didn't, was me tanning the squirrel skin. So I am a tanner by trade. I teach hide tanning and sewing clothing out of buckskin. So of course, with my first good skin, you better believe I'm going to be tanning it. So I usually use the brains of the animal or some kind of brain substitute like egg yolks to do my tanning. But this was the first game I had had in weeks. So you'd better believe I ate everything edible off of that squirrel, including the brain, which is the most amazing, delicious part of an animal, especially when you're in a situation like that, where the most important thing in your world is fat, and the brain is a big chunk of fat. It's like a squirrel truffle, like a chocolate truffle, not the mushroom truffle. It's like the most delectable, rich, amazing food you can imagine. So no way that I was saving that brain to tan the hide with. So what I did instead was I used a little bit of fat from my pemmican. So I very carefully skinned the squirrel, and then I membraned it thoroughly with my knife. The membrane is the layer that is between the muscle and the skin. So I fleshed it very carefully, getting all of that membrane off, and then I rubbed some of the fat from my pemmican. There's a loud plane right now. I'm in an area that seems to have a lot of traffic of very small planes. I'm in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge, and it's kind of a scenic area, so a lot of small planes go around, which are more noisy than the commercial planes. So I rubbed some pemmican into the hide, and then I sat in a patch of sunshine, and I worked and stretched and worked and stretched that hide as it went all the way from wet and sloppy to totally dry, at which point it was soft and pliable and nicely tanned. But the final part in the brain tanning process is smoking the hide. So I tied the hide over my fire and put some rotten birch on there to get a good smoky fire to smoke the hide. And then I have this lovely squirrel skin, and at this point I'm recognizing that indeed in this beautiful natural environment where I have all of this beautiful handmade deerskin clothing and living wild, I have this hideous garish orange knife sheath. And losing my knife wasn't really an issue because I never took that sucker off of my belt. So it's time to cover up that garish orange, and I've got a lovely squirrel skin. So I used my special modifications in my Leatherman. My dear friend Rich had helped me design a Leatherman with a bunch of modifications that would be helpful for me out in the bush. And one of the things he put on it was a buckskin awl. So he is actually a student of mine who has taken buckskin classes, so he knew just what I was looking for in a buckskin awl. And so I had that tool, plus I had scissors from the Leatherman. And I'll do a more detailed video at some point about my Leatherman and why I chose the one I did and all of the things included. But one of the things was that it had a full-size pair of scissors. Most Leathermen have small scissors that tuck to the inside. This one had the full length, so the longest tools, the same length as the knife on the outside. One of them was a good pair of scissors. That was a very specific choice because I wanted to be able to do sewing and repairs on my clothing out there. So I cut a thin piece of buckskin off of the end of my parka, and I used that for my sewing thread. So I had my awl and my sewing thread, and with those I made a knife sheath out of the squirrel skin to cover up that garish plastic. So, squirrel hide, squirrel tanning, delicious squirrel eating, a shot with my bow that I was pretty proud of, shooting a small red squirrel out of a tree by the chest. Really good shot. My first game out there, and you don't get to see it. So, you can see it on my knife sheath. That is what to me was a very, very profound squirrel. So that's one big thing I have been waiting to talk about until I knew for sure that footage wasn't going to get in. And given that it's snowy now, that is the case. So, what other exciting things were happening? Oh my goodness, so much. So, you've seen some shots of my shelter. This last episode, the only thing they really showed of me was the work I had done on my shelter, which was huge. Absolutely huge. And I'm going to do another more detailed post about that shelter because it feels like it would be too much to include in this video. I don't want to have it be over an hour long. So I'll talk again about my shelter, and I'm just going to keep kind of moving around to try to keep my face out of the sun because it's hard for the shot. So yeah. So at this point, I think we're up to day 33 or so, and there were some big things happening in my body that we don't see, thank goodness, or really hear about. And one of those things is, imagine going weeks with almost nothing coming into your belly. And imagine also very, very little of what's coming into your body is fiber of any kind. And again, imagine that you have only one vessel that holds water. And if there's food in that vessel, there's not water in that vessel. And if there's food in that vessel, you're not going down to the lakeshore to fill it up. So dehydration is a big issue out there. So combine all of those things, and it might occur to you that one physical issue that can happen out there is constipation, right? Your digestive system's kind of shutting down, very little into it. Now, I never went a full day without something coming into my belly. I was always eating some amount of berry or a teeny little nibble of the pemmican that I brought out as one of my items, or some spruce needles left over after making spruce needle tea or something. Once I got game on the fall equinox, then I was putting some meat into my body. Also, I ate everything that you can imagine eating from a squirrel. I saved the belly and the intestines to use as bait for a fish trap that I was planning to make. But other than that, everything, including the bones. So I was cooking down, as soon as I finished all of the meat, and I'll go into more detail at some point about my cooking techniques for my squirrel and my rabbit and grouse and such. But at the end, I saved every bone and I boiled the heck out of them to make a bone broth and to make the bones soft enough that I could break them for the marrow, which is a good source of fat and protein, particularly fat, which is so important out there. And I ate the ends off of the bone because there's really good minerals and calcium in the bones. So when you have very little else coming into your system, everything matters. So I was eating the bones. However, mostly meat and bones in my belly and very little fiber compacted into insanely granite hard poop. I'm talking about poop. That's right. Posting this to the public. But you know what? When you are out in a situation like that, everything going on with your body is key. And we've seen people in other seasons, I believe Jessie from season 5 he tapped because of eating so much spruce bark, and my belief is that he had a bowel obstruction, all of that jammed that he couldn't get out of. Well, I didn't have too much fiber, I had too little fiber, and so I went 12 days at one point without pooping at all, and not really feeling like it was a big deal because I was barely eating. There wasn't really anything to come through. Once I started eating and nothing was coming through, so I went like 12 days without pooping, and then I pooped a little bit, and then another like 14 days without pooping. But at that point I was starting to eat. I was starting to get game. Three game items in by like day, by the early 20s I had three game, and yeah, things were getting blocked and it was starting to get very uncomfortable. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I just want you to know that that was a major physical thing that was happening for me at that time. And that brings me to something else really important that you don't see, which is once I realized what a huge deal constipation was, I had two resolves. One was that no matter what, I was going to start every day by drinking a big pot, like the entire quart full of chaga tea. So chaga is a fungus that grows on birch trees, and it's very, very medicinal. It's delicious. It's an antioxidant, and it has all kinds of vitamins and minerals in it. So I was drinking that regularly, which I think is part of why I stayed so healthy and resilient and well in my body. Even though you see people having cramps and feeling malnourished, I felt strong. And there were a lot of things to that. One, I think, was all of the people back home eating food and like beaming me the calorie and the energies from their food. That was one of it. One was how thrilled I was to be there and how much I was loving every second, so that the hunger wasn't as big of an issue and I felt strong and resilient. But one was this amazing fungus, chaga, that I was drinking regularly. So that was one of my resolves, to help myself through this horrendous constipation issue. And then another was to be sure that I ate some amount of fiber every day. Now, I had made myself a little bit sick on cranberries early on, not like throwing up or diarrhea or anything like that, but just like sour belly from all of the acid. So I had been laying off of the cranberries. But once I realized the extent of the constipation woes, I said, it doesn't matter. I'm going to eat at least a good handful, at least a couple cups of berries every day. I'll eat them until they make my mouth raw. So making sure I had berries on hand became a priority. That was an even bigger deal once the snow started really coming. So I was having to dig berries out from under the snow. I was praying for the sun to come out and melt off some of the south side of my peninsula so I could access berries. And I knew that those berries were going to be disappearing. I was finding little eviscerated carcasses of berries where birds were eating out the insides and leaving the skins. So there's competition for the berries. So if I was going to have berries every day for who knew how long, I was planning on potentially months out there, I needed to put in a store of berries. And how am I going to do that without any storage containers? Willow. So some of the footage that you're not seeing of me up until this time is when I got some item of game, which meant I had plenty of energy and felt like I could justify further wanders. My reward to myself was clipping willow. I'm a weaver. I do a lot of basketry work, and so not only is it very utilitarian, but it's like a fun reward that's very satisfying to me to get to craft and to get to do willow. So it wasn't strictly a survival thing to clip willow, but a very important survival application to have food storage containers. So within the first, I think it was week 3, I started clipping willow that was available on the site. And I used the wire clippers of my Leatherman to do so. I was harvesting a lot of willow from a couple feet long down to a lot smaller, and I made a lovely cranberry harvest basket, which I then cut some buckskin, again, off of my parka, or maybe it was off of my boot liners. I had a lot of extra buckskin bits for such things. So I made a belt out of buckskin and a lovely harvest basket that I could wear so that I could go out on the land and harvest cranberries every opportunity I had so that I could start storing them up for winter. So I'm guessing that eventually we're going to see those, but they had already been made by the time we got to the end of the episode. And I wanted to let you know that harvesting willow was one of the craft activities that I was putting some effort into during the times like that you're not seeing in like episodes 4, 5, and 6. I was definitely out there harvesting willow. Yeah, which would have been important and something I would have wanted to do anyway, but the constipation factor really made that key. I've got some little notes here. So another important project, which unfortunately we don't get to see, is that one day I went down, the sun was setting, and that far north you don't get a lot of daylight, and a lot of the days are really cloudy and overcast. So this was a particular day where I hadn't seen the sun much, and then the sun was setting, and as it did, it got down below the cloud layer, and all of a sudden there were these beautiful rays of sunshine, and it was like a beacon to me. It was so beautiful. So I followed those beams of light down to the lakeshore so that I could stand in the sun until the last possible second as the sun set. And right in that spot, that was the furthest area I could get to that sunshine, right beneath me, I found a beautiful clay deposit. There was very, very little exposed soil of any kind in my area. As I've mentioned before, it was mostly just bare rock or jumbled rock or sphagnum moss and almost zero soil. But right on the lakeshore where the water had been lapping, there wasn't sphagnum moss, so there was a spot of really high quality soil. So I came back and I harvested, I took a flat rock and I heaped clay on top of it and then carried that back to my shelter. And I divided that clay into two different grades. So there was some that had a bunch of rocks and vegetation and just other debris in it, and that I kept for like utility clay. And then deeper down, there was some really, really nice, really pure clay that was going to be awesome for pottery. So I harvested a bunch of that pure clay and I set that aside separately so that I could use that for cookware. The reason the utility clay was so important for me was that I wanted to seal my shelter with sphagnum moss and clay, but far more important than that is I had a plan for a much more elaborate rock hearth and chimney. So I had left space open so there was nothing directly above my fire and my shelter to let the smoke escape, and so that nothing was flammable. And also, very important thing I want to mention that I'll probably talk about more in my shelter, but you see me make very, very solid walls of peeled poles inside my shelter. One of the other reasons that I did that was for fire protection, because green boughs full of resinous needles, incredibly flammable. And then especially when those get dried out, and then when they get a coating of creosote from being above a fire, like a tinder box. Absolutely a huge match just waiting to happen. And I knew that, and there was no way that I was going to risk a fire in my shelter. So that solid log wall all around my hearth, part of that was also for fire protection. But my plan was to build a stone and clay chimney. So I had all kinds of flat rocks harvested, and I had all of this clay that I harvested, and the best clay mortar is going to be clay mixed with vegetation. So also, right before freeze up, the lake levels were starting to go down a bit because as ice was forming elsewhere, it was kind of lowering the water level. So all of a sudden there was this area of shoreline exposed that had all of this really nicely broken up vegetative matter that had been like floating in the lake and beaten against the rocks. So it was perfect for mixing with clay to make a really nice mortar for making a stone hearth and chimney. So that was my plan. I had all of this lovely clay harvested, and then the temperatures dropped so far, so fast, that all of that clay was frozen solid. So I really should have prioritized making my chimney early on, but I was trying to think about things like sealing the shelter so the wind wasn't coming, and putting up cranberries before they were covered in snow, and focusing on food as much as possible, and keeping enough firewood to keep me warm at night. So that was like a project that was going to happen one of those days that I had plenty of time for it, which didn't happen in the first couple of weeks. And then the temperatures just plummeted. As you can see at this point, it's pretty cold and snowy and below freezing almost all the time during the day. And it would have to be well above freezing for some time for that clay to thaw. However, just holding it by the fire and having a warm enough day to work the clay wasn't really the issue. So I had all of this lovely clay and all of these lovely stones harvested to make a clay and stone chimney with lovely mortar with vegetative matter to give it strength. but the temperatures got so cold so fast that all of a sudden it was below freezing, and you can't work with clay when it's frozen solid. That said, I could have worked around that. I could have thawed it by my fire. It would have been a lot of time and effort, but it would have been possible. But the real trick is not just having the clay warm enough to be malleable to work with it. It's that you have to keep it above freezing the whole time until it dries. Otherwise, you're going to get ice crystals in your clay that's just going to bust it all apart. It's just going to all crumble to nothing, and the whole thing would collapse. So I missed my window to make the amazing clay hearth and chimney I had envisioned. And I had such a sweet setup envisioned with an air, and I did actually eventually get an air draft in so that I'm not pulling cold air from the walls of my shelter, but just from one specific little tube. I had a whole idea for a cooking setup that could be separate from my warming fire, little shelves and rocks that I had set up for shelves to keep food warm and to dry my socks and boots and what have you. I had so many wonderful plans, and the temperatures just plummeted so dang fast. I never got to use that clay. Also, I realized that similarly to make pottery vessels, and I harvested some very, very nice sand to mix with my clay, because you have to have a lot of what's called grog, a lot of gritty stuff in your clay in order to make it a cooking vessel that isn't going to crack when you put it on the fire. But again, I would have had to keep those pots above freezing the whole time until they were totally dry. And you can't dry a pot too fast or it's going to crack from differential heat. So I would have had to basically stay up for like 72 hours feeding my fire in order to get my clay vessels dry. And even when I did that and fired them and had usable cooking vessels, if I had left water in them for any amount of time, it would have frozen solid and it would have busted them. So many wonderful plans for all of these super useful craft projects, and the low temperatures just made those plans null, which was a bummer. Similarly, you saw me peeling a birch tree. I think the first footage they showed of me was me peeling that birch tree and licking the sap. Well, that was for a couple of reasons. One was to make a moose call. So I was absolutely determined to get big game. I knew that that was the key to the whole thing. And I went out into the woods several times with my lovely rolled birch bark moose call, doing the calls of a female moose and hanging out for hours and hours waiting, because a moose call can call in moose from up to 8 kilometers away. So it takes a while for them to get there. So these were hours and hours I spent in the woods with my moose call, calling them in. That never got shown. However, I was also peeling birch for all kinds of craft applications, some of which I did, but some of my plans, one of my major plans, was to make some watertight vessels using the birch bark, sewing them up with spruce roots, and then sealing the whole thing with pitch. So I had all kinds of pitch collected, all kinds of spruce roots collected, all kinds of birch bark collected, but then once the temperatures got cold, I realized again, storing water in a birch bark canteen as soon as it froze, which was going to happen in short order, it would have busted the birch bark. So many plans for survival that work in temperate climates just were out in the Arctic. So those are some of the things that you are not seeing in the backstory during these episodes. And let's see. Some other important things were, up until it got really cold and snowy, I had a regular practice of laundry and a regular practice of bathing every so often. And there were a couple times that I got scary chills bathing. On days where it was sunny, sometimes you get the impression that, okay, it's a warm day, it's a lovely time to bathe. There was one time that I bathed, like stripped down totally naked with hot water from my pot with some leaves from the soapberry plant to give it a little bit of lather, and washed my hair and bathed my whole body, and I got like a scary chill where it was mild hypothermia and had to sit in front of the fire for hours and hours and hours until I was functional again. Because having the surface of your body wet, even though it was sunny, it was still way below freezing, and it was not a good idea to get that cold over that much of my body. And having my hair wet was so rough. So basically, day like 28 or so was the last time I bathed my body with water, because whoa, dude, just not worth the chills. Basically, I felt amazing out there all the time. Really good attitude. I feel like that comes through, like so happy to be there. The only time that I experienced anything like fear or worry was when I got a really severe chill. That was the only time when I thought, wow, it could actually be possible that something could happen where I would feel forced to tap. Because if you get hypothermia out there and you can't use your hands and you can't get a fire going, that's a problem. So the scary chills were just enough to make me a little bit scared to be out there. Not scared to be out there, but like worried about potential future issues with more cold as it got more dramatic. So from that time, I decided I prioritize never letting myself get that cold. So I would not bathe. I would not change clothes. I stopped doing laundry because all of a sudden I needed to wear all my long underwear all the time. It was that cold. And I wouldn't do activities that I knew I was going to be getting chilled on. Like I wouldn't set snares at dusk or after the sun went down, because crouching in the cold snow, once there's no light, staying long-term frozen crouching, which is what I had to do to set snares because I didn't have snare wire. So every snare was a very elaborate process. I had to limit those to just the warmest parts of the day because I wasn't going to risk getting a scary chill. So those are some of the modifications I had to make to my activities based on being in such an extreme environment like the Arctic. Another thing that you don't see in my story, for the most part, I was doing really well physically, right? I wasn't having major injuries. I certainly wasn't getting enough to eat, but I felt really strong and good and healthy. However, about day 4, I started getting these weird bumps on the backs of my legs. Hot, rashy bumps that grew and grew into like big, throbbing goose egg welts on the backs of my legs, and I couldn't figure it out. I had absolutely no idea. It's not like I was ever going around without full layers on. It wasn't like I was getting bit by anything. I was airing out my sleeping bag really regularly to make sure there wasn't condensation in there, so there weren't any critters or spiders or bugs that could be biting me, and there was very little insect life anyway because it was really cold and really far north. So I didn't know what was going on, and then it would sometimes get better and then sometimes get worse again, and I wasn't really seeing the pattern. And here's where constipation was a benefit to me, because then I went through a long period of like 12 days without pooping at all. And during that time, the rash got better. It started going down and kind of turned into like open sores after those goose eggs went down. But I was taking good care of them. They were clean, no issues with infection, but pretty uncomfortable. And then, miraculously, after 12 days, I needed to poop, and I did my business. And that night, laying in my sleeping bag, my legs were on fire with insane, throbbing, hot pain and more welts coming. And I realized that the only time that I had the backs of my thighs exposed was when I was pooping. And again, very, very little soil, no soil really. So I was pooping in areas of thick sphagnum moss where I could cover it up. In that area, there was a lot of ground cover, and one of the ground cover things was Labrador tea. And I realized that that had been brushing against the backs of my thighs while I'm squatting in the woods to poop. Going that long period without doing so and having it heal, and then squatting and pooping and having it get worse again, finally helped me figure out that I was having a contact dermatitis, an allergic reaction to Labrador tea leaves. So from that time on, I never pooped in the sphagnum areas again. I found an area that was mostly rocky, where I had a deep crevice and no vegetation ever touching my legs. And those suckers took a long time to heal. I still had scars on the backs of my legs up until a couple weeks ago. I'd have to look. But basically I had like big purple, they looked like bruises, but big purple scars on the backs of my legs. Those welts healed. They took a very long time to heal. They were still pretty gnarly as I was in my whole recovery process from my time out. So can't talk more about the time, but just know that as of the time you're seeing, day 20, well, yeah, from day 4 to right up until where we're seeing, which I think was day 32, I also had these gnarly, big, swollen, throbby, painful welts on the backs of my legs that I'm sure were stressing my body and taking some of my calories to withstand and to heal. So another secret part of my story that you're not witnessing from the show. And yeah, I think those are the only things that I had to talk about. There's so much more, and I'm sure that more of that will come out on later posts, but yeah, trying to keep it reasonably short. So yeah, so this week I am going to be teaching hide tanning at an ancestral skills gathering. So once again, I won't be watching the episode when it comes out, and I won't be able to respond to comments and such because as of this afternoon, I am driving to where I'll be out of reception for a while. But I hope episode 7 is exciting. Looks like some folks are going to be having a rough go. I didn't see anything of myself on the previews, so I'm not even sure if I'll be on or what'll be happening with me, but enjoy episode 7, and I will look forward to watching it and giving you some more of my commentary when I can manage it. So thanks, everybody.